morning. I'm Shannon Braswell, and welcome to another Bright News discussion. I'm here with Dr. David Ilan, and today we're going to talk about the origins of ancient Israel, talk about um, his theory on that and his work. So, Dr. David Ilan, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. We're up at Tel Dan in northern Israel on our first day of excavation.
Nice, nice. Well, let's start out by maybe talking about your work and what you do uh, in Israel in Tel Dan. And
Okay, so I work at the Hebrew Union College, which is the seminary of the Jewish Reform movement. When it's a reform movement, that means you're allowed to ask difficult questions and have all kinds of theories and discuss these things even if you don't agree with each other. It's an academic institution. I direct the Nelson Glick School of Biblical Archeology on the Jerusalem campus. And that means that we have excavation projects and we do research and we have a staff of archaeologists and people who also deal with the biblical text. So our flagship project is the excavation at Tel Dan, which has been going on since 1966 with some breaks in the middle. It was initiated by my predecessor, whose name was Avram Biran. He was a very well-known Israeli archaeologist, diplomat, administrator. And I took over his job in 2003 here at the college. And we've continued his work, excavating at Tel Dan and doing other things.
wow, okay. Well, my first question I want to start with is sort of the the previous hypothesis around the origins of ancient Israel. I remember in one of your lectures, you had talked about like there were at least five major ones, right? And
Right.
uh, and maybe like the last two, I forget. One was by Israel Finkelstein,
Right.
and then the other one I don't remember his name, but those last two kind of have the most prominence right now. But can we kind of
Yeah.
start there?
So should I go over them?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
So the original theory about Israelite origins comes straight out of the biblical text. You know, the book of Exodus, Deuteronomy, Samuel, Judges, where the Israelites escape slavery in Egypt, go through 40 years of wandering in the desert. That means 2 generations. And then they are sort of cleansed of their old ways and then enter the land of Israel via Jordan. Moses dies at Mount Nebo. He is not allowed to enter the land of Israel. And then the Israelites cross into Jordan, into Israel, under the leadership of Joshua. And from that point, then they go from Jericho, you know, the walls of Jericho and the trumpets and all of that. They conquer Jericho. They go up to the hill country, a place called Ai, which means a ruin in ancient Hebrew, which is already sort of a giveaway. And then they systematically go north and south and destroy various Canaanite towns, eventually taking over the whole country. That's what's described in the book of Joshua. But in the next book of the Bible, the book of Judges, the first sentence says, "And here is the land not taken." In other words, there's already a contradiction there. And all the lowlands have not been taken, and a few other spots in the highlands occupied by various peoples, Canaanites, and others. And that's the narrative as the Bible gives us. Archaeologists in the first part of the 20th century and even before looked at this text and said, okay, let's go look for it. And they excavated various sites in the hill country, places like Bethel and a few others, and found destruction layers that archaeologically you could date to around 1200 BCE using archaeological criteria. And they said, here, the places mentioned in the Bible. Here's Ai, it was destroyed. Here is Lachish, it was destroyed. Here's Chatzor, here's a destruction layer. This is the Israelites conquering the land of Israel and then consolidating it before they apportion the various parts of the country to the tribes. And that was the initial theory regarding the conquest of Israel. It was basically what it says in the text is what happened, and archaeology demonstrates that that's the case. As time went on, already in the 1920s, but mostly in the 50s and 60s, people began to realize that not everything was working out well. For example, at Jericho, the first place, a major archaeological site, was excavated in the 20s by the Brits, and then in the 50s by another British archaeologist, Kathleen Kenyon. And in a layer where there's supposed to be this massive Canaanite destruction, there isn't even a city. There's nothing there. It was abandoned. That doesn't work. And then up in Ai, the next place that the Israelites capture, once again, there hadn't been a city there for 1,000 years. And it wasn't destroyed. It was destroyed in about 2500 BC, way before. And its name in the text was a giveaway. It means the ruin. In other words, whoever was telling the story in the biblical text saw a ruin and created this narrative that included this ruin that was there. So other people started saying, okay, what other possible explanations are there for the Israelite conquest of the land of Israel? Along came a German scholar by the name of Albrecht Alt in the 1920s, and he said, actually, the conquest was actually a quiet conquest. First, the Israelites moved up into the hill country, settled an area that was mostly empty of people. And once they became a nation and consolidated, then they started sending out parties and war parties and attacking and consolidating. And that's what really happened. The story sort of reversed the order of things. First settlement, then conquest. That was Albrecht Alt. And he was also looking at the Israelites as sort of ancient Bedouin. Arab warriors and things like that. But that sort of didn't work out either, because there wasn't enough evidence for people coming from the East, bringing their material culture over to Israel. And that's where he posited it was coming from, sort of reflecting the biblical text. There wasn't any of that. And so other people started thinking. And along came a scholar named Mendenhall. And he said, actually, what we're seeing here, and he had a Marxist orientation. And he said, actually, what we're seeing here is a revolt of the local Canaanites against their overlords and against the Egyptians who controlled the country, especially in the lowlands. They rebelled, they destroyed cities, and then they moved up to escape the Canaanite overlords into the hill country. And that's what is reflected in the biblical story. But archaeologically, it doesn't look like that's what happened. The chronologies don't work. You don't see evidence of major battles of that kind. So that theory was rejected. Norman Gottwald, another biblical scholar, followed pretty much that same model. Along came a scholar by the name of Israel Finkelstein in the 1980s, who wrote his doctoral dissertation on the hill country after he had surveyed and excavated. And he said, actually, what's happening here is a gradual process, sort of like what Alt said, but these people were always here. They're Canaanites. In the late Bronze Age, the previous period settlements were no longer safe. They became nomads. They nomadized. We don't see their settlements because nomads don't leave remains. And eventually, when the Egyptian empire in Canaan collapsed, all the symbiosis that exists between lowland cities, trade centers, and the highlands, which are where people are pastoralists and make textiles and dairy products and then trade, that coexistence disappeared. And the hill country nomads had to sedentarize. They had to make permanent settlements, make their own economy, started building terraces and growing crops in the hill country. And eventually those people became strong enough and united enough to send out prongs of conquest and ended up taking over the country and establishing a territorial state. So those were the main existing theories. There are variations on the theme, but basically those are the four main stories.
Okay. And now how is Israel sort of able to distinguish itself from if we go with the idea that they're Canaanites too, right? How are they able to distinguish themselves from the other Canaanites? Like how do you know that their culture is Israelite?
So at the beginning, probably not so easily. Initially, and it depends which theory you go with. If you go with the original rapid conquest theory, as is depicted in the biblical text, Israelites came from somewhere else. They lived in the desert for 40 years. They were nomadic. They didn't have much material culture. They were very simple, hard scrabble people, and they rejected the Canaanite culture and they built their own culture. So they have certain kinds of jars, no pictures on their pottery. They're very aniconic, no images, sort of like the biblical Israel that is depicted. If you are, let's say, Israel Finkelstein, you'll say this was a process. These were Canaanites that eventually adopted practices that rejected the old ways of things. They stopped eating pork, for example, or they didn't have walled cities. And they were very modest in the way that they portrayed. There was no art or not much to speak of, no portrayal of the human image. And this is something that gradually appeared with the coalition of a new identity of hill country people who reject the lowlands and etc. So they're different, depends on which theory you buy. You talk differently about how people identify themselves as Israelites. And I think today most scholars would suggest that actual Israelite identity really only coalesces maybe in the 9th century BC, when there really is a territorial state that has its national symbols and its national architecture. And before that, it was much more tribal, and the alliances were sort of expedient. When you need help, then you make an alliance. And when you don't need it anymore, you're on your own, sort of like what's depicted in the book of Judges.
Okay. Okay. Now, because you work at Tel Dan, right? I believe that Dan in that is speaking to the tribe Dan, right?
Right.
Is that a connection? Okay. So now, are tribes like Dan, are they incorporated fully as Israelites by that time, or are we talking more like
a later
interracial tribe, does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah. In other words, yeah. In the origins of Israel, is it just this monolithic group of people that come from Egypt and then that's it, and they have an automatic self-identity, or is it maybe more complicated than that?
Right. Thank you.
Does that sound right?
Yes.
So Israel apparently has lots of different origins. And I would not reject totally the Exodus story and a group of people coming out of Egypt with a certain religion and a certain God, or maybe even gods, and being refugees, leaving Egypt because they are persecuted. There's no way that it can be like the 2 million plus people that the book of Numbers says it must be. Because you would find something in the land in Sinai, 40 years of occupation by 2 million people, they would leave something. And in this whole millennium, Sinai is mostly empty. There's nothing there. So that you can't really take the story literally. But most of us are now pretty sure that there was some kind of exodus of a group of people, might be the Levites, because the Levites all have Egyptian names. As for the other groups, each tribe probably has its own story. And the Danites are a special story. The name Dan, first of all, the biblical text, the Danites are portrayed as being sort of weird. In the book of Genesis, they are depicted as a viper by the side of the road. That's not very nice. You know, there's something that bites the horse's feet and knocks the rider over. In the book of Deborah, the book of Judges, the Song of Deborah, the first part, chapter 4, chapter 5, when Deborah is accounting for each of the tribes and their contribution to the rebellion against the Canaanites, she says, Dan, why do you stay by the sea in your ships? What Israelite tribe has ships? I mean, Israelites are mostly hill country people. What is that? It was already strange. And in the 60s, people like Yigal Yadin and people like Michael Astor were writing that the Danites, there's something strange about them. The most famous Danite is Samson.
Okay, yes.
Samson is this really strong guy with long hair. He cavorts with Philistine women, and he tells riddles. This is a Greek hero. This is like Hercules. So there's something very Greek about Samson, and Dan sounds sort of foreign. And when you look at Egyptian reliefs in the mortuary temple of Ramses III, Ramses III does battle with sea peoples and peoples of the land, and some of them are Philistines. There's a group called Shardano, which are probably Sardinians. There's Chekeru, and there's Danuno. And the Danuno or Denyen are probably Dan. And these are sea peoples. Some people think they came from the coast of Turkey in a place that's called today Adana. And this was the tribe of Dan, and they fought against the Egyptians, and the Egyptians maybe later settled them or hired them as mercenaries or something. But in any case, they are this tribe of Dan. And when I excavated at Dan, and when I wrote my dissertation on the material culture from the 12th, 11th century BC at Tel Dan, lo and behold, there are figurines that look like Greek figurines from that period. There's pottery that has certain kinds of bird depictions on it that looks like pottery from Cyprus, from Greece, from the coast of Israel. Looks really a lot like the Philistine pottery, and the Philistines came from Crete or Cyprus, but not exactly. It's like in the same world, but not exactly. So bottom line, I followed Yigal Yadin and Michael Esther, but showing more archaeological evidence that follows textual hints that the tribe of Dan is actually originally a Greek tribe. They were called in Greek mythology the Danae. Perseus was a Danae, and Perseus saves Ariadne from an island right next to Jaffa, which is where Tel Aviv is today. And that was the original tribal inheritance of the tribe of Dan. So all these things come into connection.
Right. Now, are they, is the Bible trying to, like when they give them sort of an explanation for these tribes, right? Like I know the Bible says like Dan was the child of Jacob's handmaiden or something like that, not his first two wives. So they're trying to fit them into the narrative,
exactly,
right? To be like as part of the nation, right?
But they're also telling us they're part of the family, but they just got into the family in sort of a roundabout way.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Now, okay. Can we go back to talking about Egypt? Because this one was the one that really got me the most. I just thought that was kind of cool, actually, and I know some people might say, well, it's contradicting the Bible and stuff like that. And I try not to be as closed off like that. I mean, so can we talk about maybe what was going on between Egypt and say the Hittites and that whole like matrix, right? That I guess you would say what Israel came out of.
Where it all began.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in the second half of the second millennium BC, so like from 1500 to about 1150 BC, the Egyptians rule Canaan. It's not just a colony, it's a province of Egypt. They annexed it, basically. Okay. And in order to maintain their control, they had bases in key points in Israel, places like Ashkelon, Gaza was probably the capital, Jaffa, Beit Sha'an. I would also say Tel Dan, probably, where we dig. Right. And they had Egyptian rulers and warriors resident in these places. But as time went by, that wasn't enough. And so they incorporated local Canaanites. They actually took Canaanite aristocracy's sons to Egypt to Egyptianize them, and then send them back to rule their vassal kingdoms as Egyptian subjects and as people who enjoyed and identified with Egyptian culture. But those people were not really seen probably as the real deal. They weren't really Canaanites anymore. They were sort of bastardized because they grew up in Egypt. And there was a lot of rebellion going on, and especially in the 14th century BC, this is when we see a revolution in Egypt, the Akhenaten revolution,
Yes.
where the king Akhenaten changes the national religion. He builds a new capital outside of Memphis and outside of Thebes in a new place called El Amarna today. And he tries to change Egyptian society inside out. And that lasts for a few years, but then it fails because the old aristocracy and the old ruling structure rebels against this change and goes back to the old ways and tries to strengthen the regime in the way it was. During this period of time, Canaan was neglected as a province, and you see we have a really fascinating correspondence. We have documents in an archive from El Amarna that basically has Canaanite vassal kings complaining about each other, talking about being robbed and caravans being robbed, and this king taking that king's land, and we need the Pharaoh's help. Please send 5 chariots and 17 soldiers to help us out, please. And then the next letter says, my king, I'm your loyal subject. Why don't you answer me? You know, this is terrible neglect, and nobody knows what to do. And places like Hatzor, which are the greatest kingdoms of the time, are doing whatever they want, and the Egyptians aren't doing much about it. After El Amarna, after this new religion fails, and there's a palace rebellion, and the 18th dynasty comes to an end, and the 19th dynasty takes over, circa 1320 or so. New kings come up, Horemheb, and then the Ramesside kings, Ramses I, Ramses II, Seti I, and they say this neglect is really damaging us. There are Hittites in the Hittite Empire to the north that controls Turkey of today, northern Syria, and they're getting stronger and stronger. Their military technologies are really great. This is bad news. We need to reconsolidate because some of the vassal kingdoms in the northern part of our empire are moving over to the Hittites. They're being bribed, and this is bad. Yeah. And so they say, we need to reassert our authority. And the Canaanites are troublesome. We're going to do a whole other thing here. And they start building a series of forts, mostly in the lowland countries, areas. There aren't enough Egyptians probably that want to man those positions. And so what they do is they bring in foreigners, foreign men from all over the ancient Mediterranean and ancient Near Eastern world, from Cyprus, from Nubia, from Libya, Syria, even Hittites. And they say, you know, and a lot of times it'll be like the second, third son who's not going to inherit land, who has nothing much to do with his life. And they'll say, you come and work with us for 20 years, you'll be in our army, you'll be an officer, you'll rise up the ranks. And in the end of your tenure, we're going to give you a land grant. There's some evidence for this happening. And then you'll be your own boss, and we'll give you a land grant in a place which is on our frontier where we need eyes and ears. You will be—
where nobody wants to go.
Yeah, but these people will go because they don't have a better offer anywhere else. Exactly. Now, in the meantime, these soldiers have served the Egyptian crown in these lowland towns, and men need women, and they marry local women. And that's why all the cooking pots you find in these settlements are Canaanite cooking pots, not Egyptian cooking pots, not Grecian cooking pots or Nubian. They're local cooking pots because these guys have married local women, which leads to an interesting identity question. The kids of let's say, a Cypriot soldier and a local Canaanite woman, what is he? Is he Cypriot? Is he Canaanite? Maybe he's something else completely different, right? So this goes on for a while, and this is the Egyptian solution to putting down local rebellions and manpower shortages. And they start settling the frontiers. And my theory is that these small settlements in the hill country that previous scholars said were Israelite settlements when they came across the Jordan River and settled after their conquest, or that came over peaceably and first settled in the hill country and then spread out down to the lowlands and conquered. My theory is that these were actually instigated by the Egyptians, who were giving out land grants in the marginal territories. And these people raised families, they became clans, they made alliances. And circa 1140, 1150 BC, the Egyptian empire collapsed. It was overly complex. There was a climate crisis during this time. We have lots of evidence for that now. It collapsed. And that collapse then left all these places, all these towns, places like Tel Dan and Beit Shan, without daddy, and they had to make it on their own. And by this time, these people are a mixture of ethnicities. You know, there could be some Nubian soldier that married a local woman, and they might have called all of his family, oh, those are the Nubians.
Right.
And they might have called the other person, those are the Hittites, even though they're not really Hittites anymore. Yeah. And those are the Danites. They came from Adana. And they married this local woman from that village. And there's a couple others that came later. His brother also didn't have any land. He came too. And now everything's in chaos, and there's refugees everywhere. And some of these soldiers who have retired and have their own land or have taken over what the Egyptians used to control, send messages to their brethren who are in crisis countries, Cyprus, Turkey, famine, pirates, big chaos, collapse. Come here. We have land, we have water, we have able-bodied soldiers we can defend ourselves. You come and we'll build it. And I think that's part of the story here. So the bottom line is Israelite settlement in the hill country started as an Egyptian enterprise. Right. And after a couple of generations, it became something completely independent. Right. And over time, maybe over 200 years or so, that became Israel.
Okay. So with that, then, like when you read the Bible or you listen to Bible stories, you don't really see that explanation in the Bible. The Israelites are always sort of in contention with the Egyptians, right? That's what I see, you know, say in Exodus or something like that, right? But you don't see that sort of cohesion, except for actually, maybe I would say, except for like Joseph, right? Like Joseph becomes the like leading administrator in Egypt and things like that. He marries an Egyptian woman, I believe, right?
Right.
And then they have children and stuff like that. So why do you think that the biblical text doesn't sort of give a positive outlook towards the Egyptians?
So you have this Exodus story, which is a foundational story. It might have been a story, the story of the Levites, for example, a rebel tribe who were rejected. They were sort of like, you know, the pilgrims that settled America, who escaped persecution in England and Holland. These may have been people who maybe they were Aten worshippers, the leftovers of the Akhenaten religious revolution, who still maintained the religion and believed that there was one main God, and that was the sun god. Yahweh is probably a solar deity to begin with. Everything we can see points in that direction. And so this Egyptian group came north, and they had their story of persecution. If they were very much instrumental in putting together the biblical narrative, there's a dissonance there. If you say, these Egyptians, they actually started the settlement of the hill country, aren't they wonderful? But we escaped slavery and persecution from them the chapter before or the book before. That doesn't really work well with the narrative. Right. And probably a lot of these things were written down a couple hundred years later, and they had documents at their disposal. They tell us, for so it is written in the book of Yashar, so it says in the annals of the king, so-and-so. So they have sources, and they're editing them, and they're taking pieces out. And by this time, there is a tribal element in the country, and there are important families that need to be recognized, and the country needs to be needs to coalesce around a leadership, the kings of Israel and or the kings of Judah. And so the people that put together this narrative had a political and theological agenda. It went together, and the agenda was, we need to create a unified people here. Let's tell the stories of each of the tribes, give each of them their due. They each have their heroes, Book of Judges. And then after that, we have common heroes that become everybody's common hero. King David, we have King Solomon. And then there's this division that we all know about. Whether it really happened or not, that's another question. How Israel and Judah became separate kingdoms, that's a sore point, but we need to explain it. And the biblical text gives a very good explanation for all kinds of overtaxation and rebellion and things of that sort. So The Egyptians aren't mentioned in this early context because it didn't fit the narrative properly.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
That's the way I see it.
Yeah.
A scholar like Nadav Ne'eman will say these things were written down much later and they just forgot about that. They didn't know that the Egyptians were controlled Canaan in the late Bronze Age and it was no longer part of the collective memory of people. I actually don't buy that. I think people knew and they made a conscious decision to leave them out of the story.
Wow. Wow. That's that's a very interesting take because I never thought of it like that. And I think I hope this really gets over to people and resonates with them here. So my last question, because I know it's late over there and I don't want to hold you up, is what you're working on now at Tel Dan and some of the new things you hope to find.
So Tel Dan is located in the far north of Israel, close to the border with Lebanon. It's at the source of the Jordan River. So we drink the clear, cold waters of the Jordan every day in our excavation. Yeah. Our current goals are actually fairly modest. In the years that Biran excavated, about 33 seasons worth, a lot of things, first of all, the methodology was a little bit basic in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And a lot of information was not gathered that we need to gather. And a lot of things aren't quite clear. So in the last few seasons, we've been trying to fill in the gaps, answer specific questions. In the area that I'm mostly working on right now, we want to know for this particular period that we're talking about, 12th, 11th century BC, we don't have precise dating. In order to get precise dates, you need annual seeds, like a grain of wheat or multiple grains of wheat or peas or things like that. Olive pits are okay, although they can last for hundreds of years. So you got to be careful with them. But we want particular kinds of things that give us a precise date. And so I want to retrieve from a very clear stratigraphic context a series of 1 year annual plant remains from the destruction layers that have been carbonized so we can date them with carbon-14 and then put them in proper sequence and see if we can really date the whole process of the Danite settlement, the destruction of the city, the resettlement of the city, and look at and also the Egyptians, when they were there and when they left. So that's one of the things we're doing. Also, I want to collect botanical remains, which wasn't done in the past. We want to see, what did people eat? How did they live? What was their agriculture like? What kind of animals did they raise? Were they raising sheep and goat mostly for their wool and dairy products, or did they actually eat the meat a lot too? Those kinds of, I want to know more about the people themselves and not the biblical story and all the monumental stuff. I want to get into people's heads and what did they believe and stuff like that. Right. My colleague Ifat Taharani is working on the 8th and 9th century context, and she wants to know more about Dan's relationship with the Arameans during that time, who conquered the northern part of Israel. She also wants to know about daily life things. But she's very interested in also how it works with the biblical text. Is the biblical text really giving us a straightforward narrative? Are there things that don't quite work out? So she's coming at it from a somewhat later perspective. Okay. That's pretty much what we're about right now.
Great. Yeah, and I know you have worked a lot on the religious side of things, like the rituals and stuff like that at Tel Dan and things like that. And there's a lot of temples and worship sites. So I look forward to reading more of your articles, and I hope we can do this again maybe sometime later.
Be my pleasure.
Yeah. So okay. Well, I hope you have a great night, and get some rest.
you have a great day too.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay.
Bye, Shannon.
Okay.